Daddy? That word, that single word, had never existed. 5 years of absolute silence. 5 years of doctors telling him it was impossible. 5 years of sleepless nights, begging God for a miracle that never came. But that morning, in the middle of a cold street full of indifferent people, a barefoot girl, dirty, hungry, reached out her hand and told him something that made him explode with rage. "Give me your bread, and I'll make your son speak." He laughed. He insulted her, called her a liar, an opportunist, trash. But the boy, his son, the boy who had never uttered a single word in his entire life, let go of his hand and walked toward her. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Not the doctors, not the witnesses, not even him. Because sometimes miracles don't come wrapped in gold. They come barefoot, hungry, and asking for something so simple, it hurts your pride to give it. This is the story of a father who had everything, except the only thing that mattered, and of an invisible girl who changed his life years with a piece of bread. The city wakes up like always, rushed, noisy, indifferent. The sound of cars filled the streets from early morning. Honking horns cut through the cold morning air. People walked fast, eyes fixed on their phones, their watches, anything but what was right in front of them. Nobody looked down, and if they did, it was only to dodge the puddles left from last night's rain. On a forgotten corner, near a bakery that smelled of warm butter and fresh-baked bread, there was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, maybe less. It was hard to tell because hunger had erased any trace of childhood from her face. Her skin was dirty, her hair tangled, her feet bare, cracked from the cold pavement. She wore an old dress, way too big for her, probably found in some dumpster. The sleeves hung down to her knees. The fabric was torn in several places. But what stood out most was what she held in her hands. A piece of bread. It wasn't fresh bread. It wasn't soft or golden. It was hard, old, with patches of mold at the edges. Someone had thrown it away days ago, maybe weeks. But for her, it was all she had. And she wasn't eating it. She just held it, like it was something sacred. The girl sat against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes watched people pass by, but not with sadness, not with anger. She looked as if she knew something nobody else knew, as if she was waiting. Half a block away, a shiny black car stopped in front of the bakery. It wasn't just any car. It was one of those that costs more than a house. One of those that makes people turn and look. One of those that screams money, power, success. The door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd walked off the pages of a magazine. Italian suit, gold watch, shoes that reflected the morning light, hair perfectly styled, serious face, used to giving orders and being obeyed. His name was Richard Sullivan, and he owned half the city. Hotels, restaurants, buildings, companies. Everything he touched turned to gold. But there was something his money couldn't buy. Something that haunted him every night. Something that made him wake up with a tight chest and tear-filled eyes. In his arms, wrapped in an expensive blanket, was a small boy. His son, Matthew, 5 years old. Dark hair, big bright eyes, rosy cheeks, a beautiful boy, a perfect boy, except for one thing. He had never spoken, not one word, not one sound, not even a babble. Doctors had examined him hundreds of times. They'd run tests, MRIs, therapies. They'd brought in specialists from other countries, the best in the world. And they all said the same thing. There's nothing physically wrong. His throat is fine. His vocal cords work. But something in his brain isn't connecting. We don't know why, and we don't know how to fix it. Richard had spent millions, and nothing. His son remained silent, and every day that passed, that silence became heavier, more painful, more unbearable. Richard got out of the car with the boy in his arms. His assistant, a man in a grey suit, followed behind, carrying a tablet and talking on the phone. "Mr. Sullivan, the meeting is in 20 minutes. We should go now." Richard didn't respond. He just looked toward the bakery. "I want bread. Fresh bread. Matthew likes the smell." The assistant nodded and ran inside. Richard stayed outside holding his son against his chest. The boy looked around with those big, curious eyes. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just observed. And then he saw her. Her. The barefoot girl. Matthew went completely still. His eyes locked onto the girl as if she were the only thing that existed in the world. Richard noticed the change. He followed his son's gaze and frowned. "What are you looking at, son?" Matthew didn't answer, because he never answered, but he raised his small hand and pointed toward her. The girl had seen him too, the boy. From the moment he got out of the car, she hadn't taken her eyes off him. And now, slowly, she stood up. Her legs trembled a bit. It was cold. She hadn't eaten anything but that piece of stale bread for days, but she walked, step by step, toward them. Richard saw her approaching, and his expression changed, from neutral to annoyed. "No, no, no," he muttered. "Don't even think about it." But the girl kept walking, until she was in front of him, so small, so fragile, so dirty. And she looked up. Her eyes were deep, dark, but not empty. There was something in them, something that made Richard feel a chill. "Sir," the girl said in a soft voice, almost a whisper, "your son doesn't speak." Richard took a step back, holding Matthew tighter against his chest. "What? Are you following me? Who sent you?" The girl didn't move. "Nobody sent me." "Then get lost. I don't have time for this." Richard tried to turn, but Matthew did something strange. He stretched out his little arms toward the girl, as if he wanted her to hold him. "Matthew, no." Richard held him tighter. "Don't touch her. She's dirty." But Matthew started to cry, not with sound, because he couldn't make sound. But tears started rolling down his cheeks, and he squirmed in his father's arms, trying to reach her. Richard was confused, angry, scared. "What did you do to him? What did you do to my son?" The girl shook her head. "Nothing. He knows I can help him." "Help him?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "You? A street kid? What are you going to do? Cure him with your rotten bread?" The girl looked at the bread in her hands and then looked at him. "If you give me your bread, I'll make him speak." Silence. The world seemed to stop. People kept passing. Cars kept honking. But in that small piece of sidewalk, everything froze. Richard blinked. What did you say?" "Give me your bread, and I'll make your son speak." Richard looked at her like he'd just heard the most absurd thing in the universe. And then he exploded. "Are you crazy?" he shouted. "Who do you think you are? I have money. I can buy all the bread in this city. I don't need your garbage." The girl didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for your bread." "I don't have any bread, and even if I did, I'd never give it to you. You're a liar, an opportunist." Richard turned his back, holding Matthew tight. "If you come near my son again, I'm calling the police." He started walking toward the car. But then Matthew screamed, not with voice, but with his whole body. He twisted, kicked, hit his father's chest with his small fists. He cried desperately, because he wanted to go back. He wanted to go back to her. Richard stopped dead. He had never seen his son act like this. The assistant ran out of the bakery with a bag of fresh bread. "Sir, what happened?" Richard didn't respond. He just looked back. The girl was still there, still, with the bread in her hands, and with a look that said, "You decide." Richard got into the car with Matthew crying in his arms. The driver looked at him through the rearview mirror. "Everything okay, sir?" "Drive." The car started, but Richard couldn't stop thinking about the girl, about her words. "Give me your bread, and I'll make him speak." It was ridiculous. It was impossible. It was... What if it wasn't? Richard shook his head, trying to erase the thought. "Don't be an idiot, Richard. She's a street kid. She's crazy. Or worse, she's trying to scam you. But then he looked at Matthew. His son had stopped crying, but his eyes were still red, swollen. He looked out the window as if searching for something, as if searching for someone. "Son." Richard stroked his hair. "What was that? Why did you act like that?" Matthew didn't respond. He never responded, but his eyes said everything, and Richard knew. His son trusted her. Without even knowing her, without even understanding why, he trusted, and that terrified him. Because if his son trusted a street kid, what did that say about him? About all the expensive doctors he'd hired? About all the money he'd spent? Richard clenched his fists. "No, I'm not falling for that. It's a trap. It has to be." But that night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his huge empty bedroom. His wife had died when Matthew was born. Complications during delivery. And since then, Richard had lived with one purpose: take care of his son, give him everything, give him the best life possible, but none of that mattered. If Matthew couldn't say, "I love you, Daddy," if Matthew couldn't laugh with sound, if Matthew couldn't scream his name when he was scared. Richard got out of bed, walked to the window, looked at the illuminated city, and thought about the girl. "Who are you? Why did my son react that way to you? And what the hell did you mean by, 'Give me your bread'?" The next morning, Richard did something he never thought he'd do. He went back. He didn't tell anyone, didn't bring his assistant, didn't bring security. He just put Matthew in the car and drove. Back to that corner, back to that bakery. And when he arrived, she was there, in the same spot, with the same torn dress, the same bare feet, the same piece of bread in her hands, as if she'd never moved, as if she'd known he would come back. Richard parked the car, got out slowly. Matthew was in his arms, awake, looking toward her with those bright eyes. The girl looked up and smiled, a small smile, calm. "I knew you'd come back." Richard clenched his jaw. "I didn't come because I believe you. I came because my son wouldn't leave me alone all night." The girl nodded. "He knows." "What does he know?" Richard stepped forward. "What are you? A witch? A scammer? What do you want from me?" "I already told you. Your bread." "I don't have any bread." "Yes, you do." Richard frowned. "What?" The girl pointed toward the car. Richard turned his head, and then he remembered. Yesterday, when his assistant came out of the bakery, he'd brought him a bag, fresh bread, just baked, and Richard had left it in the back seat of the car. He'd completely forgotten about it. He walked over slowly, opened the back door, and there it was, a paper bag, with 2 pieces of bread, already cold, already hard. Richard picked it up and returned to the girl. This is what you want?" She nodded. "Just 1 piece." Richard stared at her and felt something strange in his chest, rage, confusion, shame, because he realized that it was harder for him to give a piece of stale bread to a hungry girl than to spend millions on useless doctors. It cost him his pride, because if he gave her that bread, he'd be accepting that she was right, that she knew something he didn't, and that was unbearable. "And if I give it to you?" he asked with a trembling voice. "What are you going to do?" "I'll make him speak." "How?" She didn't answer. She just extended her hand. Small, dirty, open, waiting. Richard looked at the bread in his hands, then looked at Matthew. His son looked at him with those big eyes, and Richard knew that if he didn't do this, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. So, slowly, he tore off a piece of bread and put it in the girl's hand. "If this story is touching your heart, please give me a like. That simple gesture helps me keep creating stories that inspire. And stay until the end. Because the best is yet to come." The girl closed her fingers around the bread. She looked at it for a moment, like it was a treasure. And then she did something unexpected. She broke it in two. She ate half, slowly, with her eyes closed, as if it were the most delicious thing in the world. The other half she offered to Matthew. Richard almost snatched his son away. "No, you're not giving him that. It's dirty." But Matthew stretched out his little hands. He wanted the bread. "Matthew, no." But the boy started crying again, and the girl spoke in a soft voice. "It won't hurt him. It's just bread." "It's not just bread. It's... Richard couldn't find the words, because he knew it wasn't about the bread. It was about pride. It was about control. It was about fear. Fear of trusting something he didn't understand. Fear that it would work. And realizing he'd been wrong all this time. The girl kept her hand extended, and Matthew kept crying. Richard closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let his son take the bread. Matthew grabbed it with both hands, looked at it, smelled it, and brought it to his mouth. He chewed slowly. Richard watched, tense, waiting. He didn't know for what. For his son to choke? To get sick? For nothing to happen? But then Matthew swallowed and opened his eyes very wide, as if he'd just woken up, as if something inside him had changed. The girl knelt in front of him. She put a hand on his chest and whispered, "You can speak now." Richard felt the world spinning. "What? What did you do to him?" The girl didn't answer. She just kept looking at Matthew, and Matthew looking at her. The seconds passed. 5, 10, 20. Nothing. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "I knew it. I knew this was a... duh." Richard froze. "What?" Matthew opened his mouth, and for the first time in 5 years, a sound came out. Did he? Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Matthew. Daddy." And Richard fell to his knees, sobbing, hugging his son so tight he thought he might break him, because his son had just spoken. For the first time he said, "Daddy," and Richard felt that all the money in the world and was worth nothing compared to that moment. People started to stop, because a rich, elegant, powerful man was kneeling in the middle of the street, crying like a child, and people murmured, "What happened? Is he okay? Isn't that Richard Sullivan?" The millionaire, an elderly woman, approached. "Sir, do you need help?" Richard looked up. His eyes were red, his face wet, but he was smiling like never before in his life. My son spoke," the woman frowned. "Your son? But wasn't he mute?" Yes, he was. But she..." Richard pointed to the girl. "She cured him." Everyone turned to look at the girl, who was still there, calm, with her torn dress and bare feet. "Her?" said a man with distrust. "That street kid?" "Yes." "And how did she do it?" Richard stammered. I don't know. She gave him bread, and... The man let out a mocking laugh. "Uh-huh, sure, magic bread. And did she charge you a lot for that miracle?" "No, she didn't ask me for money." "Oh, no, she just asked for food. How convenient, right?" The man crossed his arms. "Look, mister, I don't know what trick that girl pulled on you, but mute kids don't get cured with bread. Your son could probably speak all along, and you just didn't notice." Richard shook his head. "No, he'd never said a word." "Or maybe," interrupted a young woman, "it was pure coincidence. The boy was going to speak anyway, and it just happened at that moment." Others started nodding. "Right, makes sense. Kids sometimes talk late. It's not that rare. Must have been coincidence." Richard looked at them in disbelief. "It wasn't coincidence. I was here. I saw it." "You saw what you wanted to see," said the man with a condescending tone. "You clung to false hope because you were desperate. But there's no magic here. Just a clever girl who knows how to manipulate rich people." Richard clenched his fists. "She didn't manipulate me." "Oh, she didn't?" The young woman pointed at the girl. "Look at her. She's dirty, hungry. She knows people like you have a weak spot. They're kids. She told you exactly what you needed to hear, and you fell for it. Richard felt rage rising in his chest. But then, Matthew spoke again. Daddy. Why are they yelling? And everyone went quiet, because they heard it. Clear, loud, real. The voice of a 5-year-old boy. The man who'd been mocking went pale. Wait, did he? Yes. Richard stood up, holding Matthew. He spoke, and it wasn't coincidence. It was her. He pointed at the girl, but when everyone turned, she was gone. Richard spun in all directions. Where did she go? People looked confused. She was here a second ago. Did she leave? How? I didn't see her move. Richard walked quickly down the sidewalk, searched between cars, went into the bakery, asked everyone did you see a girl? Barefoot, old dress, did you see her leave? Everyone shook their heads. Richard ran out to the street. Matthew was in his arms, looking around curiously. Where are we going, Daddy? Richard almost tripped, because every time Matthew spoke, it was like hearing a miracle. We're looking for someone, son. The girl. Yes. The girl. Why? Richard stopped. Why? Because he needed to thank her. Because he needed to understand. Because he needed to know who she was. Because she'd given him something no doctor, no specialist, no amount of money could give him. She'd given him back his son's voice. Because I owe her everything, Matthew. Richard spent hours searching for her. He asked on every corner, in every store, in every shelter. Nobody knew her. Nobody knew her name. Nobody had seen her before. It was as if she'd appeared out of nowhere and disappeared the same way. Exhausted, Richard finally gave up. He went back to the car, put Matthew in his seat, and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring into space. Are you sad, Daddy? Richard looked in the rearview mirror. Matthew watched him with those big, innocent eyes, and Richard smiled, because even if he didn't find the girl, even if he never knew who she was, even if he could never thank her, his son was speaking, and that was all that mattered. No, son, I'm not sad. Then, why are you crying? Richard touched his cheek. It was wet. He let out a broken laugh. Because I'm happy. Matthew tilted his head. Can you cry from happiness? Yes, sweetheart. Yes, you can. That night in his huge empty house, Richard couldn't sleep. He'd put Matthew to bed, read him a story. And for the first time, Matthew said, "Good night, Daddy," with his own voice. Richard cried silently outside the room, because he never thought he'd hear those words. Now, sitting in the dark living room, with a glass of wine in his hand, Richard looked at a photo on the wall. His wife, Elena, beautiful, with a radiant smile. She'd died the day Matthew was born. The doctor said it was an unexpected complication, that they'd done everything possible, but it wasn't enough, and Richard was left alone, with a baby in his arms, and a void in his chest that never filled. Eleanor had always been the kindest person he knew. When they started dating, Richard was ambitious, cold, focused only on making money. But Elena, she softened him, taught him to see people, to help, to share. Richard remembered once, years ago, when they were walking down the street and saw a man begging. Richard was going to ignore him like he always did, but Elena stopped. She took out her wallet, gave him money, bought him food, sat down to talk with him. And when Richard asked why she was wasting her time like that, Elena told him something he never forgot. Because one day, Richard, maybe we'll need help, and I hope someone gives it to us. Richard closed his eyes. Elena was right. He had needed help. Help that no doctor could give him. Help that came from a barefoot girl with a piece of bread. And he almost rejected her, almost insulted her, almost ignored her. What would Elena have said if she'd seen him? Richard felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry, love," he whispered to the air. "I almost ruined everything, almost missed the chance." He got up, walked to the window, and looked at the illuminated city. somewhere out there, was the girl. And Richard decided something. I'm going to find her. I don't care how long it takes, I'm going to find her. And when I do, I'm going to thank her. I'm going to help her. I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning. Days passed. Richard hired private investigators, posted on social media, offered rewards. Looking for a girl approximately 8 years old, barefoot, old dress, last seen near the Sunrise Bakery. If anyone knows who she is or where to find her, please contact me. Thousands of people responded, but no lead was real. Some said they'd seen her in another city. Others claimed she was their daughter. Others just wanted money. Richard was starting to lose hope, until one afternoon, he got a call. It was from the bakery owner. Mr. Sullivan, I think I know who the girl you're looking for is. Richard almost dropped the phone. Really? Where is she? I don't know where she is now, but she comes here every day at noon, always at the same time. Every day? And you didn't call me before? I didn't know you were looking for her, sir. I thought she was just another street kid. But today I saw your post and I realized it was her. Richard was already grabbing his car keys. I'm on my way. Don't let her leave. I'll do what I can, sir. Richard drove like never before in his life. Almost crashed twice, ran a red light, but he didn't care. He had to get there. When he parked in front of the bakery, he ran out. And there she was, sitting in the same corner, with the same dress, the same bare feet. But this time, she didn't have bread. She just looked at the sky, as if waiting for something. Richard walked toward her slowly. He didn't want to scare her, didn't want her to leave again. Hello. The girl looked down, looked at him, and smiled. Hello, sir. Richard knelt in front of her. I've been looking for you. I know. You know, she nodded. I saw you on the news, on the posters, in the photos. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Then, why didn't you come? The girl tilted her head. Because you didn't need me until now. What? Of course I needed you. I needed to thank you. I needed to... You needed to accept. Richard frowned. Accept what? That you don't control everything. The words hit Richard like a punch. The girl continued in a soft but firm voice. You have money, power. You can buy whatever you want. But you couldn't buy your son's voice. And that broke you. Because you realized there are things money can't fix. Richard felt tears burning his eyes. Then, who are you? The girl smiled. I'm just a girl. No, you're not just a girl. You healed my son. You did something impossible. I didn't do anything impossible. I just gave him what he needed. Bread? Faith. Richard blinked. Faith. Your son didn't speak because he was afraid. Afraid of not being heard. Afraid of disappointing. Afraid of not being enough. But when he saw me, he knew I understood him. Because I'm afraid too. Every day. Afraid of not finding food. Afraid of sleeping on the street. Afraid of being invisible. But I keep going. Because I have faith. Richard swallowed. And the bread. The bread wasn't for him. It was for you. For me? Yes. You needed to learn to give, to trust, to let go of control. Your son couldn't speak because you didn't know how to listen. But when you gave me that bread, when you put your pride aside, you opened a door, and your son walked through it. Richard sat in silence, because he knew she was right. All this time. The problem wasn't Matthew. It was him. How did you know all that? The girl shrugged. Because I lost someone too. My mum. 2 years ago, and before she died, she told me something. What did she tell you? That people can only receive miracles when they're ready to give them. Richard felt the world stop. Your mum. Who was she? The girl didn't answer. She just stood up. I have to go. Wait. Richard gently grabbed her arm. Please, let me help you. I can give you a house, food, clothes, school, whatever you need. The girl shook her head. I don't need that. What do you need then? She looked at him directly. For you to help others like me. Richard blinked. What? There are many kids on the street. Hungry, cold, invisible. Don't help me. Help them. And before Richard could respond, she left, walked slowly down the sidewalk, and disappeared into the crowd. Richard stayed there kneeling, looking at the place where she'd been, and he knew that he'd just met someone special, someone who had changed his life, not with money, not with power, but with faith and with a piece of bread. 3 months later, the city had changed. Well, not the whole city, but a part of it, because Richard Sullivan, the cold and ambitious millionaire, had done something nobody expected. He opened a shelter for street kids, a huge, warm place with clean beds, hot food, teachers, doctors, psychologists, everything free for any child who needed it. He called it Eleanor House, in honor of his wife, the woman who always told him to help others. On opening day, there were hundreds of people, press, politicians, families, but Richard only looked for one face, the girl's. He'd sent invitations to all the shelters in the city, posted announcements, gone personally to look for her, but he didn't find her. And now, as he cut the ribbon and people applauded, he felt something was missing. I wish you were here, I wish you could see this. The ceremony ended. The guests left. The children entered the shelter with eyes full of wonder and hope. Richard stayed outside, looking at the sign. Matthew was beside him, holding his hand. Daddy, why did you do this? Richard knelt in front of his son. Because someone taught me that miracles exist, but only if we're willing to share. The girl. Yes, son, the girl. Matthew smiled. She was pretty. Richard laughed. Yes, she was. Do you think she'll come back? Richard looked at the sky. I don't know, Matthew, but I hope so. And then he heard a voice. I came back. Richard turned sharply, and there she was. The girl, but she wasn't dirty anymore. She had clean hair, combed, a new dress, shoes. She looked different, but her eyes were still the same, deep, serene. Richard felt his heart jump. You came. She nodded. I told you to help others, and you did. Richard took a step forward. I couldn't have done it without you. The girl shook her head. Of course you could. You always had the power. You just needed a reason to use it. Richard crouched in front of her. I want you to stay. Here. At the shelter. Let me take care of you. Let me give you what you deserve. The girl smiled sadly. I can't. Why? Because there are more people who need help, and I have to keep going. Richard felt a pang in his chest. So, is this the last time I'll see you? She tilted her head. Maybe, or maybe not, depends. On what? On whether you keep sharing your bread. And with that, the girl turned around and walked toward the street. Richard wanted to shout, wanted to run after her, but he didn't, because he knew that she wasn't his. She belonged to everyone who needed a miracle. Matthew pulled his father's sleeve. Daddy, is she an angel? Richard looked at his son and smiled. I don't know, Matthew, but if she's not, she sure looks like one. 6 months later. Eleanor House had helped more than 200 children, given them shelter, food, education. Some were adopted, others found their families, others simply found a place where they felt safe. Richard went every day, not just to supervise, but to be with the children, to read to them, to play with them, to listen to them, because he'd learned something, that miracles don't come from above, they come from within, from the small decisions we make every day, from gestures we think are insignificant, from a shared piece of bread. And although he never saw the girl again, he felt her presence in every child he helped, in every smile he brought back, in every life he changed. One day Matthew asked him, Daddy, do you still think about her? Richard smiled. Every day, son. Do you think she's okay? Yes. I think she's exactly where she needs to be. Matthew thought for a moment. I want to be like her when I grow up too. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Oh yeah? Yeah. I want to help people, even if I don't have much, even if it's just a piece of bread. Richard hugged his son tight. You're a good boy, Matthew. Thanks, Daddy. And in that moment, Richard knew it had been worth it. All the pain, all the fear, all the struggle, because his son hadn't just learned to speak. He'd learned something much more important. He'd learned to see others, to see what really matters. And that was the real miracle. That night, Richard sat in the living room. Matthew slept in his room. The house was silent. But Richard didn't feel alone, because he knew that somewhere in the city there were children sleeping in warm beds because of him. There were children eating because of him. There were children dreaming because of him. And it all started with a barefoot girl and a piece of bread. Richard closed his eyes and whispered to the air, "Thank you." He didn't know if she could hear him, but he said it anyway. Because some things don't need an answer, they just need to be said. And so this story ends. A story about pride and humility, about wealth and poverty, about miracles that come from the most unexpected places, because sometimes what we need most doesn't cost money. It only costs opening our hearts and sharing our bread. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what touched you most about this story? I love reading each of your messages, every story you share, every lesson you take from these tales. Because in the end, these stories aren't just mine. They're ours. See you in the next one. God bless you.